I will be talking basically about what we did to make Quake 2 VKPT look like it does now, basically the transition from Q2 VKPT to Quake 2 RTX. And I will be mostly just telling a story, and it's not a very technical kind of talk, although I do have some technical details here. So we started with an image that looked like this. It looks interesting. I mean, you have nice shadows, you have all the specular reflections, but it still doesn't quite look right. Doesn't feel natural, right? And we tried to investigate why. One of the first things that we discovered is that Christoph used a texture pack in his work. That's for the better, but still, we were not sure of the quality of these textures. Like, are they physically based? Are they, like, what color space are in? Are they good? So we started by just removing those textures and worked our way down from, up from the textures in the original Quake 2. And now, if you look at this picture, you can see actually some more very specific issues with it. One of them is that all the shadows on the left are very dark, although if you looked at a similar map in real life, basically, you would see that the light from the sky and from the local lights will bounce off the objects, and those areas will just not be as dark. So there's something going on there. Another thing is that the images of local lights, they don't exactly blend in with the environment, because that light on the left, it's probably just two triangles, and these two triangles have a texture, and they are tagged as an emissive object. So the entire texture is counted as emissive, although the fixture itself of the light should not emit anything. And finally, you can notice that the reflections on the floor are inconsistent with the image that we see reflected, because the local lights are quite dim compared to the sky, but their reflections are brighter than the reflection of the sky. So there is something up with either the reflection themselves or the material of the floor. And finally, the skylight itself is actually too dim, because in real life, the local lights, like artificial light sources, are typically orders of magnitude dimmer than the sun and the sky. So we tried to fix all that. The first thing was that we made the sky much brighter. And we also figured out that people are not used to see red or saturated, like red or yellow sky. And for that reason, when you have a red illumination from the sky, it doesn't look natural to you. So we tried to desaturate the environment map just by applying a very simple transform. That made the image look different, arguably better. And yeah, like I said, we just made the skylight intensity much higher, like I think 20 times higher initially. And you can notice that the shadows on the left the shadowed areas on the left are not so dark now, because we have more light from the sky. What we didn't notice at first, though, is that the shadows from the barrels here are missing now. And that's actually it was a big problem. And let me explain to you why is this a big problem, and let's look at this selected region in more detail before denoising and before textures. So this is what it looks like on the left with a dim environment map like it originally was. It's a fairly low noise signal where most of the lighting comes from the local light on the left of the barrel. But now when we make the environment map much brighter, we get this salt and pepper noise, what it's called. A fairly sparse subset of very bright pixels, because the size of the opening into the sky in this room is fairly small. But when a ray hits the sky, it gets a lot of illumination. So we have maybe something like 5% of the pixels here having those bright skylight illumination values. But on average, they make something pretty dim, because they're just 5%. So the problem with that is that when you have such a mixed signal, it just messes up the denoiser. So what's happening here is that let's just plot the brightness over position, basically. It's a cross-section of the previous frame, of the previous slide. So when you have no bright environment map, we have these two sets of dots, which are stochastic samples of lighting from the local lights. One of them has some lighting on the left, but no lighting on the right because it's a shadow. Overall, we have a fairly low variance in the signal, and as a result, the variance-guided filter has pretty low width. So it doesn't blur too much, and the shadow is preserved. And that curve on the left slide is what you get after denoising. It's a nice sharp-ish shadow. But now when we add the skylight, which is bright but sparse, we get a lot of variance in the signal. So in order to efficiently filter that variance, we have to increase the filter width. And that large filter width basically destroys all the detail in the shadow. But like I said, we did not notice that until a few days later. For some reason, we just were concentrating on fixing the noise from the sky. And I will talk about how we fixed it in a couple of slides. So the next thing, I'm just basically showing you screenshots of various in-between development versions of our Quake 2 RTX. So the next thing was that we tried to adjust textures and tone mapping. First of all, like I said, the emissive objects in the scene were disconnected from the environment because they were all completely treated as emissive. We tried to fix that by applying a simple threshold function to the luminance of pixels in the emissive objects, and that kind of worked. Like if the texture luminance is greater than x, like 0.5, multiplied by 10, that works. Now, we also figured out that the textures are probably stored in some weird color space. Maybe it's baked as RGB, maybe it's something else, but it's not what you want to see in albedo. They are just too high contrast. And we tried to fix that by applying basically inverse RGB plus a few minor tweaks to the textures before feeding them into the path tracer. That made the picture much smoother. And the ambient lighting here in the room looks more natural for that reason. It's basically just very smooth. The next thing that we did was we added sunlight that brought back the contrast to the image that we lost by making the textures less contrasty. And that sunlight also adds visible diffuse global illumination. And when you move the sun, because nothing is pre-computed here, when you move the sun, you get all the dynamic GI updated in real time, and it's very cool to see. What we also did is that we fixed the missing shadows problem by separating the denoiser into two channels. Because, like I said earlier, we have this low noise and low intensity signal for the direct lighting, and we have a high noise and high intensity signal for the indirect lighting. So we just split that into two channels, and that actually worked really well. Finally, well, not finally, but next thing is we tried to do something about the materials. We tried various approaches like upscaling the original Quake textures with HQX or with various AI-based filters. We tried generating normals from the albedo or tried like deriving roughness from albedo, but none of that really works. What you want is actually physically based materials, physically based normal maps and roughness maps and specular maps. So what we ended up doing is we took the texture pack from the modding community from Quake 2 XP. Apparently, most of that was also used in Christoph's work. But we also added support for the other maps, not just diffuse, not just albedo. We added support for specular and roughness maps, emissive maps, which contributes greatly to the look, because instead of trying to figure out if that texture is maybe emissive, try to apply a threshold function, you just take a texture made by some artist and that acts as a light. That's very cool, and it works extremely well on some maps where most of the illumination is from local things like, I don't know, computer racks or whatever. And finally, of course, normal maps that help break up the surfaces, help make them much less smooth looking. Now, the next thing is that we added a procedural environment map to replace the horrible original environment maps from Quake 2. Well, horrible in the sense that they are very, very low res. We didn't have any artist-painted maps to replace them with, but we could do some physically based simulation of atmosphere. That's what we did, of sun color, depending on how the sun travels through the atmosphere, sunlight travels through the atmosphere. And we also added procedural mountains to the horizon just to fill it with something. And those mountains are actually pretty cool. They are fractal based and they react to the lighting in the atmosphere. That atmosphere is also HDR, so you get very bright lighting from the sky when it's daytime. because the sky is bright, and you get fairly dim and blue, like deep blue lighting from the sky at dawn. It looks very cool and natural. The sun color itself also depends on the position in the sky, and again, that lets us do things like high noon or sunrise or sunset, and they look different. And finally, of course, we added volumetric lighting, which is not really ray traced, but rather we ray march through a shadow map here. We render a static shadow map when the sky moves. It's just a very coarse kind of shadow map, 2K by 2K, I think, and we ray trace it because we can. We don't have to update it on every frame, you know. It was just easier to implement. We had very limited time there. So this is the kind of final image that we get from this renderer. This is the Q2DM6 map that we used in the keynote presentation a few days ago. But let's break it down into all the lighting components and how it works, how it travels through the denoiser. This is the raw output of the path tracer. It's actually a very, very difficult scene for a path tracer and for the denoiser to compute, because it's only illuminated by those bright spots of light coming from the sky, from the sun on the left. Everything else is dark. There are no local lights here. And for this reason, you get this very high noise picture with only a few spots of low noise sunlit surfaces. So this is the direct diffuse channel containing only the sunlight. It goes through the SVGF denoiser, very, very similar to one used in the original QZVKPT. We just tuned it a little bit. And this is what we get out of it. That picture of snow in space is the indirect diffuse channel. It goes through a denoiser that is slightly different from SVGF because it's no longer variance guided. It apparently doesn't work. I mean, when you try to pass this kind of noisy signal through SVGF, it just doesn't really converge. It's not wide enough, and it always covered with those small patches of light in the result. So we removed the variance guidance, but we still are using the gradient samples to try and reject invalid lighting. It doesn't work great, but it's something. So in the end, we get this denoised picture. What's also interesting about it is that we project the lighting, the indirect lighting, onto first two spherical harmonics to get some directionality in it, because we have normal maps. And if we try to blur the indirect lighting over the surface with a normal map, we just don't have enough kind of surface to blur it over, because the surfaces are broken up with those lines on the floor and so on. So for the filtering, we use geometric normals, which are flat because the geometry is very simple here. But we work with those two spherical harmonics here. And then after denoising, we project the spherical harmonics lighting onto the actual normal map normal, and we get this detailed look. Although much of it is lost after we apply the textures, because that's how GI basically works. And the textures that we use from Quake to XP, however great they may be, they still have some amount of baked lighting in them, and that's very difficult to remove. Finally, we have actually a third denoiser channel, which is indirect specular, because we discovered that adding specular lighting to the direct lighting channel doesn't work well enough, because specular tends to be brighter, and it also tends to change more dynamically, because specular reflections depend a lot on the position of the camera. So like if you look at the light and you strafe around, it will invalidate a lot of the picture, and we don't want to do that with regular diffuse illumination, because that's actually perfectly static. So we separated the specular into its own channel, and we apply a purely temporal denoiser, very, very simple temporal denoiser to that. But again, it's guided by the gradient samples, so that we don't get that horrible kind of ghosting that you can get with a purely temporal thing. This is what we get out of the temporal denoiser for specular. Combining all these channels gives us that. This is just all the irradiance channels before multiplying them by the albedo. And multiplication by albedo gives us the final picture, of course. Overall, the pipeline looks like this. We start with the primary rays, which are separated into their own render paths. The reason for doing that, well, we have just basically a couple of reasons for doing that. One is performance. We can extract a little bit of performance that way because the primary arrays are coherent. They are very efficient to trace. And we also want to make the path tracing shader much shorter so that we don't hit issues like instruction cache hit rate on the GPU, because the path tracing shader is actually very, very, very long. So we separate that into a path. It actually could be replaced by rasterization. That would work, and that would probably save like half a millisecond at an ATP. But again, possible, but we didn't. Now, then we go through the path tracer, which produces a few channels. One of them is the transparent channel. Sorry, give me a second. Transparent channel that contains things like glass and particles. So the original renderer did not have particles in it, and we added that, and we do not need to denoise any of that, so that channel just is applied after composition. Now, the G buffer is pretty obvious. We have albedo and normals there. Indirect diffuse that goes through the spatiotemporal filter without variance guidance, but with spherical harmonics. Direct diffuse that goes through SVGF, and specular that goes through the temporal filter. After that, all the channels are composited on top of the G buffer, and then temporal anti-aliasing is applied. After temporal anti-aliasing, we have a few post-passes like God rays, that volumetric lighting thing, flow explosions, simple bloom pass to highlight bright objects, and tone mapper with dynamic eye adaptation. Now let's take a look at the updated path tracer. We start with primary rays, and let's just, as an example, assume that the primary ray hits the water. We can reflect off the water, or we can refract through the water based on some conditions like similar to stochastic sampling. So some pixels get reflections, some get refractions. And let's follow the ray that goes in the reflected direction. First of all, we cast a shadow ray towards the sun to determine the direct sun shadow, obviously. And we pick a random point on the sun disk to get the soft, airy light shadows from the sun. Second is direct light shadow. That is very similar to what Christoph talked about. So we pick a random triangle from the list of direct lights in the sector, or we pick a random dynamic light. We actually replaced all the mesh-based dynamic lights with spheres, because that is much, much faster and it looks just the same. Now, we also have the bounce ray, which can be either diffuse, in which case it's cast in a random direction, or it can be specular, in which case we sample the GGX and DF and reflect the ray. Finally, after we find our bounce surface, we cast a ray towards the sun to get illumination, to get bounce in direct lighting from the sun. Or if we don't hit the secondary surface, we just get illumination from the sky. Finally, we have a ray that goes towards another local light for indirect bounce. Actually, we don't have a ray there because we don't do shadowing for indirect local light illumination. It just doesn't make any, well, it does make a little bit of difference visually, but it's not worth the performance. And finally, I would like to show you just some beauty shots of what we can get with this kind of renderer. This is just some water with all the reflection, refraction, and extinction effects, because as the rays go through the water, they also lose some energy. This is a look from under the water to the top. Again, some more water, some mountains on the horizon. Global illumination in an interior scene. Again, global illumination from the sky in an interior scene without a direct sunlight. Local illumination by emissive surfaces like that pool of weird transparent lava. Local illumination from emissive surfaces. These things on the pillars are actually not treated as local lights. They are not sampled by that stochastic triangle sampling thing. They are just emissive textures. And we sample those emissive textures when we cast a bounce ray towards the surface. And if that bounce ray happens to hit a surface with an emissive texture, that emissive color goes into the GI channel and goes through the denoiser. And again, some colorful local lights, base 2. sunset, or rather after sunset, with some dark blue sky and local illumination from local lights. And this is basically a summary of almost all that we can do, including all the emissive surfaces, lasers, glass with reflection, refraction, sunset, mountains on the horizon, and all that. So some minor statistics and acknowledgements. This is our development team, or rather a list of people who contributed directly or indirectly. There's a lot of people here, and it was a very fun project because we had very, very little time here, just 6 weeks from early February when we started working on this to the keynote version this Monday. And a lot of people just wanted to contribute something, like either to implement one or other effect or to, I don't know, help with some modeling or textures. And finally, we would like to thank the modding community for Quake 2 XP for the weapon models, again, from XP that we use, for other textures, and of course, its software for Quake 2 itself. Thank you.